For a few years after she divorced Andrew Crawford, Emily worked as a librarian in a Wall Street brokerage house, then got another job. She joined the editorial staff of a biweekly trade journal called Food Field Observer. It was pleasant, undemanding work, writing news and feature stories for the grocery industry. Sometimes when she composed a headline quickly and well, so that so that the spaces counted out right the first time. Hotel bar butter hit sales peak. Margarines fade. She would think of her father. There was always a dim chance that the job could lead to employment on a real magazine, which might be fun. Besides, college had taught her that the purpose of a liberal arts education was not to train, but to free the mind. It didn't matter what you did for a living. The important thing was the kind of person you were. And most of the time she thought of herself as a responsible, well-rounded person. She lived in Chelsea now, in a place with tall windows facing a quiet street. It could easily have been made into an interesting apartment if she cared enough to bother about such things. In any case, it was big enough to give parties in, and she liked parties. It also made a snug little temporary home for two, and during that time there were a good many men. In the space of 2 years she had two abortions. The first would have been the child of a man she didn't like very much, and the central problem with the second was that she couldn't be sure whose child it would have been. After that second abortion, she stayed home from the office for a week, lying around the apartment alone or taking hesitant, painful walks along the empty streets. She thought of going to a psychiatrist. Some of the people she knew went to a psychiatrist, but it would cost too much and might not be worth the effort. Besides, she had a healthier idea. On a low, sturdy table in her apartment, she set up the portable typewriter her father had given her as a high school graduation present and began work on a magazine article. Abortion, a Woman's View. She liked the tentative title, but couldn't settle on an opening sentence, or what she had learned to call a lead. It is painful, dangerous, immoral, and illegal, yet every year more than blank million women get abortions in America. That had a nice ring to it, but it set her up for a kind of hortatory stance she would somehow have to maintain throughout the article. She tried another attack. Like many girls of my age, I had always assumed that abortion is a dreadful thing, to be approached, if at all, with the fear and trembling one reserves for a descent into the outer circles of hell. That sounded better. But even after she'd changed girls to women, it failed to please her. Something was wrong. She decided to skip the lead for now and plunge into the body of the article. For many hours she wrote many paragraphs, smoking many cigarettes that she was unaware either of lighting or of putting out. And she went over it with a pencil, scribbling revisions in the margins and sometimes on whole new pages. Rev A, paragraph 3, page 7. Feeling a heady sense of having found her vocation. But the messy stack of manuscript was there waiting for her in the morning, after a fitful sleep, and she had to acknowledge with an editor's gay-lit eye that it didn't read well at all. When her week of sick leave was over, she went back to the office, grateful for the orderly rhythm of an 8-hour day. For several evenings and most of one weekend, she worked on the abortion article, but in the end she stowed it in a cardboard box that she called My Files and put the typewriter away. She would need the table for parties. Then suddenly it was 1955 and she was 30 years old. And of course, if you want to be a career girl, that's fine, her mother said, on one of the rare and dreaded evenings when Emily went down to her place for dinner. I only wish I'd found a satisfying career when I was your age. It's just that I do feel it's not a career, it's only a job. Well, all the more reason then. It's just that I do feel it's time for you to, I won't say settle down. Lord knows I never settle down. I just mean get married again, have children. Well, is that so strange? Don't you know any young man you'd like to marry? Sarah told me she and Tony loved the last man you brought out there. What was his name? something? Fred Stanley. He had come to bore her beyond endurance after a few months. She had taken him to St. Charles only on a whim because he was so presentable. Oh, I know, Pookie said with a world-weary smile digging into her cool spaghetti. She had a full set of false teeth now, which greatly improved her smile. It's none of my business. Her business came up later that night, after she'd had too much to drink. It was a grievance Emily had heard many times before. Do you know it's been more than 6 months since I was out at St. Charles? Sarah never invites me. Never invites me, and she knows how I love it out there, how I love to spend time with the children. I call up every Sunday and she says, well, I guess you'd like to talk to the boys now. And of course, I love talking to them, hearing their voices, especially Peter, he's my favorite. And then when we're finished, she comes back on and says, this is costing you a fortune, Pookie. We better think about your phone bill. And I say, never mind the phone bill. I want to talk to you. But she never invites me. And the very few times I've suggested it myself, she says, I'm afraid the next weekend wouldn't be convenient, Pookie. Huh, convenient. There was a dribble of spaghetti sauce on her mother's chin, and Emily had to fight an impulse to get up and wipe it off. And when I think of the weeks and weeks I spent out there when Tony was gone in the Navy and all three of those babies were in diapers, how I cooked and scrubbed, and the furnace didn't work half the time, or the pump either, and we had to carry water from the main house, did anyone ever ask if that was convenient for me? To emphasize her point, she shook the long ash of her cigarette defiantly on the floor and took another drink of her cloudy, finger-printed highball. Oh, I suppose I could always call Joffrey. He understands. He and Edna'd probably invite me, but still. Why don't you? Emily said, inspecting her watch. Call Joffrey and maybe he'll ask you out for a weekend. Oh, well, you're looking at your watch. All right, I know. You have to get back to your job and your parties and your men and whatever else it is you do. I know. Go ahead. And Pookie waved her moist cigarette in dismissal. Go ahead, she said. Go ahead, run along. The following spring, the job of managing editor on Food Field Observer fell vacant, and for a few days Emily thought she might be promoted. But instead they hired a man of about 40 named Jack Flanders. He was very tall and spare, with a sad, sensitive face, and Emily found she couldn't keep her eyes off him. His office was separated from hers by a glass partition. She could watch him frown over his pencil or his typewriter, watch him talk on his telephone, watch him get up and stand gazing out his window as if lost in thought. And he couldn't have been thinking about the job. He reminded her a little of her father long ago. Once when he was on the phone, she saw his long face break into a smile of such pure delight that he could only have been talking to a woman, and she felt an irrational twinge of jealousy. He had a deep, resonant voice, and he was very courteous. He always said, thanks, Emily, or that's fine, Emily, when she brought him something in the line of duty, and once he said, that's a pretty dress, but he never seemed to meet her eyes. On the day of a deadline, when everyone was tired and overworked, she opened a manila envelope to find 6 glossy photographs, each of what looked like a shallow box or tray made of porous white cardboard. Each box was of different proportions and each picture taken from a different angle with different lighting to emphasize a separate aspect of its design. The press release that came with them was breathless, with phrases like revolutionary concept and bold new approach. But she distilled from it the information that this was how fresh cuts of meat might now be packaged for sale in supermarkets. She wrote a story long enough to fill half a column with a 2-column head. Then she marked up 4 of the pictures for single-column cuts, wrote short captions for them, and took the finished job to Jack Flanders. Why so many pictures? He inquired. They sent 6, I only used 4. He said, frowning. Wonder why they didn't put any meat in them. A couple of pork chops or something. Or show a guy's hand holding the box so you'd get an idea of the size. He scrutinized the 4 photographs for a long time. Then he said, you know something, Emily? And he looked at her with the beginnings of the same smile she'd seen him submit to on the phone that other day. There are times when one word, is worth 1,000 pictures. Remembering it later, she was able to agree with him that it hadn't really been all that funny, but at the time, and maybe it was just the way he said it, her laughter was overwhelming. She couldn't stop. She was weak. She had to lean against his desk for support. When it was over, she found him looking at her with a shy, happy face. "Emily," he said, "think you might come out for a drink with me after work tonight?" He had been divorced for 6 years. He had 2 children who lived with their mother, and he wrote poetry. "Published?" she asked. "3 times." "In magazines, you mean?" "No, no, books. 3 books." He lived in one of the drab blocks of the West 20s just off Fifth Avenue, where random residential buildings are pressed in among the lofts, and his apartment was what she guessed could be called Spartan. No rug, no curtains, no television. After their fine first night together, when it seemed abundantly clear that this particular long, skinny man was exactly the kind she had always wanted, she prowled along his bookshelves, wearing his bathrobe, until she came to 3 slim volumes with the name John Flanders on their spines. He was out in the kitchen making coffee. "My God, Jack," she called, "you were a Yale younger poet." "Yeah, well, it's kind of a lottery," he said. "They have to give it to somebody every year." But his self-effacement didn't quite ring true. She could tell how pleased he was that she'd found the book. He almost certainly would have showed it to her if she hadn't. She turned it over and read one of the endorsements aloud. "In John Flanders we have an authentic new voice, rich in wisdom, passion, and perfect technical control. Let us rejoice in his gift." Wow. "Yeah," he said in the same proud, bashful way. "Big deal, huh? You can take that home with you if you'd like. In fact, I'd like you to. The second book's okay, too. Probably not as good as the first. Only for Christ's sake, don't mess with the third one. It's lousy. You wouldn't believe how lousy. Sugar and milk?" While they sat sipping coffee, looking out at the tan and green loft building, she said, "What are you doing on a trade paper?" "Gotta have some kind of a job. And the point is, it's easy. I can do it with my left hand and forget it when I come home." "Don't poets usually work in universities?" "I've had that. Did it for more years than I can count, kissing ass with a department chairman, sweating out tenure, fending off hordes of solemn, dense little faces all day, and having them haunt you at night. And the worst part is you end up writing academic poetry. No, baby, believe me, Food Field Observer is a better deal. Why don't you apply for a Guggenheim?" "Had it. Had the Rockefeller, too." "Can you tell me why the third book is lousy?" My whole life was a mess then. I'd just been divorced. I was drinking too much. Guess I thought I knew what I was doing in those poems, but I didn't know my ass from third base. Sentimental, self-indulgent, self-pitying, miserable stuff. The last time I saw Dudley Fitz, he barely nodded to me. "And how's your life now?" "Oh, still pretty much a mess, I guess, except I found that sometimes—" He worked his hand up inside the sleeve of the bathrobe to her elbow, which he fondles as if it were an erogenous zone. "Sometimes, if you play your cards right, you get to meet a nice girl." For a week they were never apart. They spent the nights either at his place or at hers, and she never had enough solitude to read the first book, until she took a day off from work for that purpose. It wasn't easy. She had read a lot of contemporary poetry at Barnard and had always done well enough in her explications, but she never read it for pleasure. She went through the early poems too quickly, getting only impressions of their ideas. Then she had to go back and study each one to appreciate how it was made. The later poems were richer, though they retained the quality of seeming to have been spoken in Jack's voice. And almost the whole of the final section of the book was devoted to a single long poem, so intricate and containing what she guessed were so many levels of meaning that she had to read it 3 times. It was almost 5 o'clock before she was able to call him at the office and say she thought the book was great. Honest to God, she could almost see the delight in his face. "You wouldn't bullshit me, would you, Emily? Which one do you like the best?" "Oh, I like them all, Jack, really. Let me think. I love the one called A Celebration." It almost made me cry. Oh? He sounded disappointed. Well, yeah, that's a pleasant little formal lyric, but it hasn't got much meat on its bones. What about the poem, the one called Hand Grenade? Oh, yes, that one too. It has a nice acidity to it. Acidity, good word. That's exactly what it was supposed to have. And of course, I guess the only important question is what did you think of the last one, the big one? I was coming to that. It's beautiful, Jack. It's very, very moving. Hurry and come home. Early in the summer, he was invited to teach for 2 years in the writer's workshop at the State University of Iowa. You know something, baby? He said when they both read the letter. Might be kind of a mistake to turn this down. I thought you hated teaching. Well, but Iowa's different. The way I understand it, this workshop is wholly separate from the English department. It's a graduate program, kind of a kind of a professional school. The kids are carefully chosen. They're not really students at all. They're young writers. And the only teaching I'd have to do would be 4 or 5 hours a week. Because the idea is, see, the teachers are supposed to produce their own stuff while they're out there. So they give you plenty of time. And I mean, Christ, if I can't get this book wrapped up in 2 years, there's something really the matter with me. Besides, he said, shyly rubbing his chin with his thumb, and she could tell that this next consideration would be the clincher of his argument. Besides, well, I know this sounds dumb, but it's kind of an honor to be invited out there. Must mean somebody doesn't think my last book sank me forever. Well, all right, Jack, but the honor's still there whether you accept the invitation or not. So think about it. Do you really want to go to Iowa? They were both on their feet and pacing the floor of his apartment, as they'd been doing since he opened the letter. He walked over to her across the bare boards, put his arms around her, and bent down to hide his face against her hair. I do want to go, he said, but I'll only go on one condition. What's that? If you come with me, he said huskily, and stay with me and be my girl. In August, they both quit their jobs on Food Field Observer, and on the last weekend before they left for Iowa, she took him out to St. Charles. Oh, I like him, Sarah said when she and Emily were alone in the sun-shot kitchen. I really like him a lot. And Tony does too, I can tell. She paused to lick a fragment of liver paste from her finger. You know what I think you ought to do? What? Marry him. What do you mean, marry him? You're always telling me to marry people, Sarah. You say that about every man I bring out here. Is marriage supposed to be the answer to everything? Sarah looked hurt. It's the answer to an awful lot of things. And Emily almost said, How would you know? But caught herself in time. Instead, she said, well, we'll see. And they carried plates of sloppily made hors d'oeuvres back into the living room. Well, of course, my war was a pretty dismal business, Jack was saying, crawling around Guam with a radio on my back, but I do remember those sleek little Magnum Navy fighters. I used to wonder what it must be like to be up there in one of them tooling around. You ought to see the ones we're turning out now, Tony said. Jet fighters. Strap yourself into one of those jobs and shoom! He made a kind of salute, knifing the upright flat of his hand straight ahead from his temple to suggest the speed of the takeoff. Yeah, Jack said. Yeah, I can imagine. When the boys came in, out of breath, Emily tried not to be too effusive about how much they'd grown since her last visit, but the changes were remarkable. Tony Jr. was 14 now and big for his age, already built like his father. He was a nice-looking kid, but there was something a little vacant about his smile, admitting at least the possibility that he might grow up to be an amiable fool. And Eric, the youngest, had developed a guarded look that was more sullen than shy. Only Peter, the middle one, the one Pookie always called her favorite, held her attention. He was thin and tense as a whippet. He had his mother's large brown eyes, and he looked intelligent even while chewing bubblegum. Hey, Aunt Emmy, he said around his chewing, remember the presents you gave me when I was 10? The present? What present? No, the presidents. And finally she did remember. Every Christmas she spent too many hours buying stuff for the boys. She would wade grudgingly through department stores on sore feet, breathing stale air and quarreling with exhausted clerks. and 1 year she had settled on what she could only hope was a suitable gift for Peter, a flat cardboard box containing white plastic statuettes of every American president through Eisenhower. "Oh, the presidents," she said. "Right. Anyway, I really enjoyed them." "Oh, did he?" Sarah said. "You know what he did? He made this big excavation out in the yard like a park, with lawns and groves of trees and a river running through it, and bridges over the river, and he set up all the presidents in different places, each with a different sized pedestal according to his reputation. He gave Lincoln the highest pedestal because he was the greatest, and he put ones like Franklin Pierce and Millard Fillmore very low. Oh, and he gave William Howard Taft a very wide pedestal because he was the fattest. And he "Okay, Mom," Peter said. "No, but really," she went on, "I wish you could have seen it. And you know what he did with Truman? At first he couldn't decide what to do with Truman, and then I think you've about covered it, dear," Tony said with a barely perceptible wink at their guests. "Oh," she said. "Well, all right." And she quickly took a drink to hide her mouth. That mannerism had never changed. Whenever Sarah was embarrassed, after she told a joke and was waiting for the laughter, or when she was afraid she talked too much, she would go for her mouth as if to cover her nakedness. With Cokes or popsicles as a child, with drinks or cigarettes now. Maybe all the years of splayed, protruding teeth and then of braces had made her mouth the most vulnerable part of her for life. Later that afternoon, the boys began wrestling on the floor until they knocked over a small table, and their father said, "All right, men, shape up." It was his standard, all-purpose admonition for them. Evidently, it was something he'd learned in the Navy. "There's nothing for them to do in here, Tony," Sarah said. "Let them go back outside, then." "No," she said, "I've got a better idea." And she turned to Emily. "This is something you've got to see. Peter, get the guitars." Eric folded his arms across his chest to show he didn't mind being left out, and the older boys clambered into another room and came back with 2 cheap guitars. When they were sure their audience was ready, they stood in the middle of the floor, filling the small house with sound, and gave an impersonation of the Everly Brothers. "Bye-bye, love. Bye-bye, happiness." Tony Jr. was only hitting a couple of simple chords and chanting the words. Peter did all the difficult finger work, and he seemed to be putting his heart into the song. "They're great kids, Sarah," Emily said when they'd gone outside again. "That Peter's really something. Have I told you what he wants to be when he grows up?" "What? President?" "No," Sarah said, as if that might be one of several viable alternatives. "No, you'd never guess. He wants to be an Episcopalian priest. I took him to the Easter service at the little church here in town a few years ago, and Peter never got over it. Now he gets me up to take him to church every Sunday, or else he hitchhikes in." "Oh, well," Emily said, "I imagine that's something he'll probably outgrow." "Not if I know Peter." At the dinner table, exhilarated by his afternoon of showing off, Peter interrupted the adults with so many silly remarks that Tony told him to shape up twice. The third time, when he put his napkin on his head, Sarah assumed command. "Peter," she said, "shape up." She glanced quickly at Tony to see if she'd said it right, then at Emily to see if it had sounded funny, and then she hid her mouth in her glass. "I understand you're on the radio," Jack Flanders said to Sarah later that evening, when the adults were alone in the living room. "Oh, not anymore," she said, looking pleased. "That's all over now." In the early 50s, she had served as hostess for a Saturday morning housewives program on the local Suffolk County radio station. Emily had heard it once and thought she did very well, but the program had expired after 18 months. "It was only a little local station," Sarah explained, "but I did enjoy it, especially writing the scripts I love to write." And that led her into a subject she had clearly wanted to bring up for hours. She was writing a book. One of Geoffrey Wilson's ancestors on his mother's side, a New York man named George Fall, had been a Western pioneer. Together with a group of other Easterners, he had helped to clear and settle part of what was now Montana. Little was known about George Fall, but he had written many letters home during his adventures, and one of his nephews had transcribed them into the form of a pamphlet, privately printed, a copy of which had come into Geoffrey Wilson's possession. It's fascinating stuff, Sarah said. Of course, it's pretty hard to read. It's all in this very quaint, old-fashioned style, and you have to use your imagination to fill in the gaps. But the material is all there. I figured somebody's got to do a book on this. It might as well be me. Well, that's quite an undertaking, Sarah, Emily said, and Jack said it certainly did sound interesting. Oh, the project was still in the very early stages, she assured them, as if to minimize their envy. She had made a rough outline, finished the introduction, and done a first draft of the opening chapter. But the chapter still needed work. She didn't even have a title yet, though she was thinking of calling it George Falls America, and she would have to do a lot of library research on the period as she went along. The book would take time, but she loved doing it, and it was a wonderful feeling just to be doing something again. Emily said, I can imagine. Might even be a little money in it, Tony said, chuckling. That'd certainly be a wonderful feeling. Sarah looked shy and then suddenly bold. Would you like to hear my introduction? She asked. It isn't often I have an audience of two real writers. Darling, she said to her husband, why don't you fix us all another drink and then I'll read my introduction. With her shoes off and her ankles snug beneath her buttocks, holding her trembling manuscript high in one hand and allowing her voice to fill out the timbre appropriate for a small lecture hall, Sarah began to read aloud. The introduction told of how George Fall's letters had been preserved, and how they had provided the basis for this book. There followed a brief summary of his travels that included many dates and place names, and even that was easy to listen to. Emily was surprised at how well the sentences flowed, but then Sarah's radio script had surprised her too. Tony looked sleepy during the reading. He had probably heard it before, and his tolerant, downcast smile as he stared at his drink seemed to say that if this sort of thing gave the little woman pleasure, well and good. Sarah had reached her conclusion. George Fall was in many ways a noble man, but he was not unique. In his time there were countless others like him, men who dared, who gave up comfort and security to confront a wilderness, to face adversity against seemingly hopeless odds to conquer a continent. In a very real sense, then, the story of George Fall is the story of America. She put the manuscript down, looking shy again, and took a deep drink of whiskey and water. That's excellent, Sarah, Emily said, really excellent. And Jack said something polite to show he was in total agreement. Well, it probably needs work, Sarah said, but that's the general idea. Your sister's very sweet, Jack Flanders said when he and Emily were on the train going home. And she does write well, I wasn't just saying that. I wasn't just saying it either, I know she does. I can't get over how soft and dumpy she's getting, though. She used to have the most beautiful figure I've ever seen. Yeah, well, that happens to a lot of full-blown women, he said. That's why I like him skinny. No, but I see what you mean about your brother-in-law. He is kind of a bore. I always get the most terrible headaches when I go out there, Emily said. I don't know why, but it never fails. Could you sort of rub the back of my neck? Iowa City was a pleasant town, built in the shadow of the university along a slow river. Some of the straight, tree-lined, sun-splashed residential streets reminded Emily of illustrations in the Saturday Evening Post. Was this what America really did look like? And she wanted to live in one of their ample old white houses. But then they discovered a small, odd-looking stone bungalow on a dirt road in the country, 4 miles out of town. It had been built as an artist's studio, the real estate lady explained. That accounted for the outsized living room and the tall picture window. It wouldn't be at all practical for people without children, she said, but for just the two of you it might be fun. They bought a cheap used car and spent several evenings exploring the countryside, which turned out to be far less monotonous than they'd expected. I thought it'd all be cornfields and prairies, Emily said, didn't you? And here are all these rolling hills and woods, and doesn't the air smell wonderful? Yeah. And it was always a pleasure to come home to the little house. Soon there was a staff meeting from which Jack returned in an exultant mood. I don't mean to depart from my customary boyish modesty, baby, he said, pacing the floor with a drink in his hand. But I suppose I happen to be the best poet they've got out here. Maybe the only one. Jesus, you ought to meet these other clowns. You ought to read them. She didn't read them, but she met them at several raucous and confusing parties. I liked the older man, she told Jack as they drove home one night. What's his name? Hugh Jarvis? Yeah, well, Jarvis is okay, I guess. He wrote some good stuff 20 years ago, but he's washed up now. What'd you think of that little bastard Kruger? He seemed very shy. I liked his wife, though. She's interesting. She's somebody I'd like to get to know. Hmm, he said. Well, if that means having the Krugers out for dinner or anything like that, you better forget about it right now. I don't want that phony little son of a bitch in my house. And so there was no one in the house but themselves. They were isolated. Jack had set up his work table in a corner of the main room, and he sat there for most of the day, hunched over his pencil. You ought to use the little room for working, she said. Wouldn't that be better? No. I like being able to look up and see you, moving in and out of the kitchen, hauling the vacuum cleaner. Whatever the hell you're doing. Lets me know you're really here. One morning, when the housework was done, she brought out her portable typewriter and set it up as far as possible across the room from him. A New Yorker discovers the Middle West. Except for parts of New Jersey and maybe Pennsylvania, I had always pictured everything between Hudson River and the Rockies as a wasteland. Writing a letter? Jack inquired. No, something else. Just the sort of idea I have. Does the typewriter bother you? Of course not. The idea had been simmering in her mind for days, complete with that title and that lead. Now she settled down to work. There was Chicago, of course, a gritty and inadequate oasis to the north. And there were isolated spots like Madison, Wisconsin, renowned for their quaintly charming imitations of Eastern culture. But for the most part, there was nothing to be found out there but vast reaches of corn and wheat and stifling ignorance. The cities bustled with people like George F. Babbitt. The numberless small towns were haunted by what F. Scott Fitzgerald called their interminable inquisitions that spared only the children and the very old. Was it any wonder that all the famous writers born in the Middle West had fled it as soon as they could? Oh, they might indulge themselves in sad rhapsodies about it afterwards, but that was only nostalgia. You never heard of them going back there to live. As an Easterner born in New York itself, I greatly enjoyed showing stray, bewildered Middle Western visitors through my part of the world. Here, I would explain, this is the way we... Is this idea of yours a big secret? Jack called from across the room, or can you tell me about it? Oh, it's just... I don't know exactly what it is. It might turn into a magazine piece or something. Oh? I don't know, I'm just fooling around. Good, he says, that's what I'm doing too. On Mondays and Thursdays, he disappeared into the campus, and when he came back, he was always on edge, either chagrined or exhilarated, depending on how his class had gone. These kids, he grumbled once, pouring himself a drink. These fucking kids. Give them half a chance and they'll eat you alive. He drank too much on the good days, too, but he was better company. Hell, this job's a breeze, baby, if you don't try too hard. Walk in there and talk about what you know, and they lap it up as if they'd never heard it before. Maybe they never have heard it before, she said. I imagine you must be a very good teacher. You've certainly taught me a lot. Yeah? He looked shy and greatly pleased. About poetry, you mean? About everything. About the world. About life. And that night they could scarcely wait to be finished with their cooling dinner before they fell into bed. Oh, Emily, he said, stroking and fondling her. Oh, baby, you know what you are? I keep saying you're great, and you're perfect, and you're tremendous. But none of those words are right. You know what you are? You're magic. You're magic. He told her she was magic so many times on so many nights that she finally said, Jack, I wish he'd stop saying that. Why? Just because it's getting a little old. Old, huh? Okay. And he seemed hurt. But she had never seen him happier than when he came home 3 hours late on one of his class days, a week or so later. Sorry, sweetheart, he said. I got to drinking with some of the kids after school. Did you eat? Not yet. It's all in the oven. Damn. I would have called you, but I wasn't watching the time. That's all right. As they ate dried out pork chops, which he washed down with bourbon and water, he couldn't stop talking. The damnedest thing. There's this kid, Jim Maxwell. Have I told you about him? I don't think so. Big burly guy. Comes from some godforsaken place in South Texas. Wears cowboy boots and all that. He always scares me in class because he's so tough. And so smart. Damn good poet, too. At least he will be soon. Anyway, tonight he waited until all the other kids left the bar, so it was just the two of us having one last round, and he gave me this very squinty look and said he had something to tell me. Then he said, "Damn, baby, this is too much." He said that when he read my first book, it changed his life. Isn't that the goddamnedest thing? Well, she said, that's a great compliment. No, but I mean, I can't get over it. Can you imagine me writing anything that could change the life of some total stranger in South Texas? And he forked a slice of pork chop into his mouth and chewed it mightily, savoring his pleasure. By November, he had come to admit, or rather to insist, that his own work wasn't going well at all. He would get up from his tiny desk many times a day to stalk the floor, flipping cigarette butts into the fireplace. The bed of ashes in the fireplace became so choked with cigarette butts that only a roaring log fire would burn them out. And saying things like, "Who the hell ever said I was supposed to be a poet anyway?" "Can I read some of what you've been working on?" she asked once. No, you'd only lose what little respect for me you have left. You know what it's like? It's like bad light verse. Not even good light verse. Dum-de-dum-de-dum and dum-de-diddly-poo. I should have been a songwriter in the 1930s, only I probably would have failed even at that. It'd take about 27 of me to make an Irving Berlin. He stood slumped and staring out the big window at the yellowed grass and naked trees. I read an interview with Irving Berlin once, he said. The guy asked him what his greatest fear was, and he said, "Someday I'm going to reach for it, and it isn't going to be there." Well, that's me, baby. I know I had it, I could feel it, the way you feel blood in your veins, and now I reach for it, and it isn't there. Then the long, white Middle Western winter settled in. Jack went back to New York to visit his children over Christmas, and she had that little house to herself. It was lonely at first until she found she rather enjoyed being alone. She tried working on her magazine article, but its dense, clotted paragraphs seemed to be getting nowhere. Then on the third day she received an ebullient Christmas letter from her sister. She had been exclusively concerned with Jack Flanders for so long that it was oddly refreshing to sit down with this letter and remember who she was. All is well at Great Hedges, and all send their love. Tony has been putting in much overtime, so we rarely get to see him. The boys are thriving. Sarah's handwriting was still the neat, girlish script she had taught herself in junior high school. Well, it's sweet handwriting, dear, Pookie had told her, but it's a little affected. Never mind, though. It'll develop more sophistication as you get older. Emily skimmed through the inconsequential parts of the letter until she came to the meat of it. As you may know, Pookie has lost her job. The real estate agency went bankrupt, and naturally we've been very concerned about her. But Joffrey has come up with a very generous solution. He is fixing up the apartment over the garage into a nice little home for her, where she can live rent-free. She is eligible for Social Security. Tony feels it may be a little awkward having her here, and I agree. Not that I don't love her, but you know what I mean. But I'm sure we'll all manage. Now for the other big news. We are about to inherit the main house. Joffrey and Edna will be moving back to New York in the spring. She hasn't been at all well, and he is tired of the long commute and wants to be closer to his office. When they move out, we'll move in and rent out the cottage for some badly needed income. Can you picture me taking care of that enormous place? I have shelved George Fall because it turned out that I couldn't proceed very far without doing research in Montana. Can you imagine me ever getting to Montana? I am still writing, though, planning a series of humorous sketches about family life, the kind of thing Cornelia Otis Skinner does so well. I admire her work tremendously. There was more. Sarah always ended her letters on a cheerful note. even if she had to force it, but the essential sadness of the message from St. Charles was clear. When Jack got home, he was filled with high purpose. No more fooling around, he announced. No more drinking too much every night. Above all, no more letting the students' work take up so much of his time. Did she realize he'd let things slide to the point where he was working on student manuscripts almost every day? What kind of nonsense was that? Because here's the thing, Emily. I did a lot of thinking on this trip. It did me good to get away and kind of put things in perspective. The point is, I think I do have a book. And the only thing that stands in the way of getting it done by summer, the only thing, is my own half-assedness. If I'm careful and lucky, you have to be lucky as well as careful, I can bring it off. Well, she said, that's wonderful, Jack. The winter seemed to go on forever. The furnace broke down twice. They had to huddle at the fireplace all day, wearing sweaters and coats with blankets around their shoulders. And the car broke down 3 times. Even when both were in working order, there was a pattern of bleak discomfort to the days. Going into town meant putting on heavy socks and boots, wrapping a muffler up to your chin and shivering until the car heater blew warm, gasoline-scented air in your face. Then driving the 4 treacherous miles on ice and snow under a sky as close and white as the snow itself. One day, when Emily was finished at the supermarket, she had learned how not to be stultified by the supermarket, how to deal with it in a quick, competent movements that brought results. She sat for a long time in the steaming brilliance of the laundromat. She watched the whirl of suds and soaked cloth in the porthole of her machine. Then she watched the other customers trying to guess which were students and which were faculty and which were people from the town. She bought a chocolate bar and it tasted surprisingly good, as if without her knowing it, sitting here and eating this chocolate was the one thing she had wanted to do all day. Waiting for the drying cycle to end, she began to feel a vague dread, but it wasn't until she was at the warm, lint-speckled folding table that she figured it out. She didn't want to go home. And it wasn't the drive through snow and ice she dreaded, it was going home to Jack. That fucking Kruger, he said, on slamming into the house one evening in February. I'd like to kick his balls in, if he has any. Bill Kruger, you mean? Yeah, Bill. The cutesy-poo little bastard with the dimpled chin and the charming wife and the 3 cutesy-poo little girls. And that was all he said until he'd made himself a drink and finished half of it. Then, with one thumb at his temple and his hand spanning his brow, as if he were afraid to let her see his eyes, he said, Here's the thing, baby. Try to understand. I'm what the kids here call traditional. I like Keats and Yates and Hopkins and shit, you know what I like. And Kruger's what they call experimental. He's thrown everything overboard. His favorite critical adjective is audacious. Some kid'll get stoned on pot and scribble out the first thing that comes into his head, and Kruger will say, that's a very audacious line. His students are all alike, the snottiest, most irresponsible kids in town. They think the way to be a poet is to wear funny clothes and write sideways on the page. Kruger's published 3 books, got another one coming out this year, and he's in all the fucking magazines all the fucking time. You can't even pick up a magazine without finding William fucking Kruger. And baby, here's the kicker. Here's the punchline. The little cocksucker is 9 years younger than me. Oh. Well, so anyway, what happened? Shit. This afternoon was what they call Valentine's Day. That means they pass out preference sheets and the kids all write down which teacher they want for the next semester. Then the teachers get together afterwards and sort them out. You're not supposed to care about it, of course, and everybody acts very nonchalant, but my God, you ought to see the red faces and the trembling hands. Anyway, I lost 4 of my kids to Kruger. 4. And one of them was Harvey Klein. Oh. She didn't know who Harvey Klein was. There were evenings when she didn't listen very carefully. But this was plainly an occasion for solace. Well, Jack, I can certainly see how that would make you feel bad, but the point is it shouldn't. If I were a student in a place like this, I'd want to work with as many different teachers as I could. Doesn't that sound logical? Not very. And besides, you didn't come out here to waste your energy hating Kruger or even teaching Harvey Klein. You came here to get your own work done. He took his hand away from his forehead, squeezed it into a fist, and socked the table, which made her jump. "Right," he said. "Emily, you are absolutely right about that. The damn book is all that ought to concern me every day. Even at this very minute, if I have half an hour before dinner, I ought to be over there at the desk working, instead of bleeding on you with a lot of trivial, invidious shit like this. You're right, baby. You're right. I want to thank you for bringing it to my attention." But he spent the rest of the evening in a silent, impenetrable gloom. It was either that night or a very few nights later that she woke up at 3 to find him gone from the bed. And she heard him moving around in the kitchen, dropping ice cubes into a glass. The air around the bed was heavy with smoke, as if he'd lain here smoking for hours. "Jack?" she called. "Yeah, sorry I woke you up." "That's all right. Come on back to bed." And he did, but he didn't get in. He sat slumped in his bathrobe in the darkness, drinking, and for a long time the only sound in the house was his occasional hacking cough. "Oh, this isn't me, baby," he said at last. "This isn't me." "What do you mean that it isn't you? It seems pretty much like you to me." "I mean, I wish to God you could have known me when I was working on my first book, or even my second. That was me. I was stronger then. I knew what the hell I was doing and I did it, and everything else fell into place around that. I didn't snivel and snarl and shout and retch and puke all the time. I didn't walk around like a man without skin, without flesh, worrying about what people thought of me. I wasn't." He lowered his voice to show that his next point would be the most telling and damning of all. "I wasn't 43 years old." The coming of spring made everything a little better. For many days there was a warm, deep blue sky. The snow shriveled on the fields and even in the woods, and one morning, on his way to school, Jack came bursting back into the house to announce that he'd found a crocus in the yard. They began taking long walks every afternoon, down the dirt road, out across the meadows and under the big trees. They didn't talk much. Jack usually walked with his head down and his hands in his pockets, brooding. But their time outdoors soon became the high point of Emily's day. She looked forward to it as eagerly as Jack looked forward to the drinks they had when they got home. Each afternoon she waited with growing impatience for the hour when she could put on her suede jacket, go over to his desk and say, "Want to take a walk?" "A walk," he would say, throwing down his pencil as if delighted to be rid of it. "By God, that's a great idea." And the walks were even better after they inherited a dog from some neighbors down the road, a tan and white mongrel terrier named Cindy. She would lope along beside them or prance in circles around them, showing off, or go racing into the fields to burrow. "Look, Jack," Emily said once, clutching his arm. "She's going into that pipe under the road. She wants to go through the whole thing and come out the other side." And when the dog emerged muddy and trembling from the far end of the pipe, she called, "Wonderful, Cindy." "Oh, good dog, good dog." She clapped her hands. "Wasn't that neat, Jack?" "Yeah, sure was." Their most memorable walk was on a breezy afternoon in April. They had gone farther than usual that day, and heading home across a great rutted field, tired but invigorated, they came to a solitary oak tree that seemed to reach into the sky like an enormous wrist and hand. It compelled them to silence as they stood in its shadow looking up through its branches. And they would both remember that Emily got the idea first. She took off her suede jacket and dropped it on the ground. Then she smiled at him. She thought he looked quite handsome, with the wind blowing his hair flat against his forehead, and began unfastening the buttons of her blouse. In no time at all they were naked and embracing on their knees. Then he helped her to lie back on the moist earth, saying, oh baby," and they both knew that Cindy would almost certainly begin to bark if anyone dared to approach this sacred place. Half an hour later, back in the house, he looked up bashfully from his whiskey and said, "Wow, oh wow, that was really something." "Well," she said, lowering her eyes, and she could feel herself blushing, "what's the point of living in the country if you can't do things like that occasionally?" It rained almost steadily for the next month. Dead earthworms littered the muddy walk from the door to the car, and last year's leaves were brown flat against the picture window to slide down in its seams. Emily took to spending hours at that window, sometimes reading, but more often than not, staring out into the rain. "What do you see out there anyway?" Jack asked her. "Nothing much. Just thinking, I guess." "What are you thinking about?" "I don't know. I ought to take the laundry in." "Ah, come on. The laundry can wait. All I mean is, if something's troubling you, I'd like to know about it." "No, no," she said. "Nothing's troubling me." And she went to get the laundry together. When she passed his desk again on her way to the door, hauling the heavy denim bag, he looked up and said, "Emily?" "Hmm?" He was 43 years old, but at that moment his half-smiling face looked as helpless as a child's. "You still like me?" he asked. "Oh, of course," she told him, and busied herself with her raincoat. Near the end of the spring semester, he said he thought his book was substantially finished, but it wasn't a triumphant announcement or even a happy one. "The thing is," he explained, "I don't feel ready to send it off yet. The important work is done, I think, but it needs cutting and pruning and fixing. I think it might be smart to hold it back for the summer. Set a deadline for myself in September and have the whole summer to go over it." "Well," she said, "good. You'll have 3 months without classes." "I know, but I don't want to stay here. It'll get hot as a bit. It'll get as hot. Okay. It'll get hot as a bitch, and it'll be dead. Besides, do you realize how much money we've got in the bank? We could go damn near anywhere." She had two quick visions. One of heavy surf crashing on rocks and white sand, east coast or west, and one of purple cloud-hung mountain ranges. Would love on a beach or love in the mountains be better than this? "Well," she said, "where do you want to go?" "That's what I've been leading up to, baby." And the way he looked now reminded her of her father long ago, on Christmas morning, when she and Sarah would tear into the wrappings of gifts that turned out to be exactly what they wanted. "How'd you like to go to Europe?" They flew well ahead of the Earth's turning. Heathrow Airport caught them dazed and trembling and gritty-eyed from lack of sleep at 7 o'clock in the morning. There wasn't much to see on the ride into London. It seemed not very different than riding into New York from St. Charles. And the cheap hotel recommended by the travel agency was filled with weary, disoriented tourists like themselves. Jack Landers had lived in London with his wife soon after the war, and now he kept remarking on how much everything had changed. "The whole town's so American-looking," he said. "I guess we'll find that pretty much all over." But he insisted that the underground was great. "Wait till you see how much better it is than the subways in New York," and took her out to what he called his old neighborhood, where South Kensington and Chelsea are divided by the Fulham Road. The bartender at his old pub failed to recognize him until after Jack had spoken his name and shaken his hand. Then he became very hearty, but it was clear from the way he didn't quite meet Jack's eyes that he was pretending. "The point is, I'm too old to care whether some half-assed bartender remembers me," Jack said as they drank warm beer at a corner table, well away from the dart game. "And besides, I've always hated Americans who come back from England with corny stories about marvelous little pubs. Let's get out of here." He took her up a side street to the darkened house whose basement flat he had once occupied, and he drew away from her to stare at it, slumped and brooding for a very long time. Emily stood near the curb looking idly up and down the street, which was so quiet she could hear the whir and click of the mechanism for changing the traffic light on the corner. She knew it was silly to be impatient. He might be working on an idea for a poem, but that didn't help increase her patience. "Son of a bitch," he said quietly on turning away from the building at last. Memories. Memories. This was a mistake, baby, coming to this house. It's really shot me down. Let's get a drink. A real drink, I mean." But the pubs were closed. "It's okay," he assured her. "There's a little club around this next corner called the Apron Strings. I used to be a member. I think they'll let us in. Might even run into some people I used to know." Instead, they ran into a stone-faced West Indian doorman who denied them admission. The club had changed management since Jack's time. They got into a taxicab and Jack leaned earnestly forward to address the driver. "Can you take us someplace where we can get a drink? I don't mean some clip joint. I mean a decent place where we can get a drink." And when he'd settled back beside Emily for the ride, he said, I know you think this is dumb, baby, but if I don't get some whiskey in me tonight, I'll never get to sleep." They were greeted in an anteroom by a man in a tuxedo who looked Egyptian or Lebanese. It's very expensive here," he told them with a kindly, confident smile. "I would not recommend it." But Jack's thirst went out, and they sat in a dim carpeted cellar where an effeminate young man played sloppy cocktail piano, and where the bill for 2 drinks came to $22. "Probably one of the all-time dumbest things I've ever done in my life," Jack said, as they rode back to the hotel. And when they walked into the lobby, they found the bar very much open for business. "Oh, Jesus," he said, smiting his temple with the heel of his hand. "That's right, I'd forgotten. Hotel bars stay open late, too. Isn't this the goddamnedest thing? Well, guess we might as well have a nightcap." Sipping whiskey she didn't want, hearing the strident dissonance of British and American voices. One handsome young Englishman at the bar reminded her of the way Tony Wilson had looked in 1941. Emily knew she was going to cry. She tried to avert it with a childhood trick that had sometimes worked before, pressing both thumbnails hard into the tender flesh beneath the nails of her index fingers, so that the self-inflicted pain might be greater than the ache of her swelling throat. But it was no use. "You okay, baby?" Jack inquired. Oh, Jesus, you look like you're just about to... Wait till I pay the check and can you hold it till we get upstairs?" In their room, she cried and cried, while he put his arms around her and stroked her and kissed her shuddering head, saying, "Oh, baby, come on now. I know it was awful, but it was all my fault. Besides, it's only $22. "It isn't the $22, she said. "Well, the whole lousy evening then. The way I dragged you out to see that house and went into one of my big self-indulgent depressions. It isn't you. Why do you always think everything's you? It's just that this is my first night in a foreign country, and it's made me feel so vulnerable." And that was true enough, she decided as she got up from the bed to blow her nose and wash her face. But it was only part of the truth. The rest of it was that she didn't want to travel with a man she didn't love. Paris was better. Everything looked just like the photographs of Paris she had studied all her life, and she wanted to walk for hours. "Aren't you getting tired?" Jack would say, lagging behind. He had lived here too in the old days, but now as he trudged along with a look of petulant bewilderment in his eyes, he was the picture of a bumbling American tourist. When they walked into the vast silence of the Notre Dame, she had to thrust 2 fingers in the back of his belt to restrain him from walking right into the little cluster of chairs where people were praying. They had planned on an extended stay in Cannes so that Jack could work. He said he'd done some of his best work of his life in Cannes. It held a sentimental attraction for him. Besides, it would be practical. She could be out at the beach all day while he secluded himself. And she did enjoy the beach. She loved to swim, and she was willing to admit she liked the stares of approval she received from suntanned Frenchmen at the way she looked in her bikini. Thin, yes, they seemed to say. Small-breasted, certainly, but nice. Very nice. When her day was over, she would go back to the hotel and find their room blue and acrid with cigarette smoke. "How'd it go?" she would ask. "Terrible." He'd be up and pacing, looking haggard. "You know something? A book of poems is no stronger than its weakest poem. And some of these, 5 or 6 of them, are so weak they're going to drag the others down. The whole damn book's going to sink like a stone. Take a day off. Come to the beach tomorrow." No, that won't help. Nothing would help. And for days he fussed and grumbled. At last he said, "It's too expensive here anyway. We're spending a fortune. We could try Italy or Spain. And they tried both. She liked the architecture and sculpture of Florence. She kept seeing things she'd learned about in art history classes long ago. And in the shops and stalls around the covered bridge, she bought small gifts for Pookie and Sarah and the boys. But Rome was hot enough to melt your eyeballs. She almost fainted on her way to visit the Sistine Chapel. She had to sway and stagger into an unfriendly cafe for a glass of water. She had to sit staring into a Coca-Cola for a long time before she gathered strength to go back to the stifling hotel, where Jack was waiting with a pencil behind his ear and another one clamped in his teeth. They both insisted they liked Barcelona. It had trees and sea breezes. They found a cool room within their price range, and there were good places to sit and have a beer in the afternoons. But Madrid was as inscrutable and unyielding as London. The only good thing about Madrid, Jack said, was the bar at their hotel, where you always got a generous shot and a half in your glass when you ordered whiskey escoso. Then they were in Lisbon, and it was time to go home. Nothing had changed in Iowa City. The sight of their little house, and then of the big room inside it, called up vivid memories of the year before. It was as if they had never been away. Emily drove off to pick up Cindy from the house where they boarded her, and when the dog recognized her, wagging and quivering and showing her teeth, she realized she'd been looking forward to this moment all summer. In October, Jack said, "Remember I said I'd set a September deadline for myself? That ought to teach you to trust me and my half-assed deadlines." "Why don't you send it off the way it is?" she said. "A good editor could help you weed out the weak poems. Maybe he could even help you make them better." Nah, no editor's that good. Anyway, it isn't just a few poems that are weak. The whole book has a sickly, neurotic cast to it. If I had the guts to let you read it, you'd see what I mean. I'm going to do one thing you suggested, though. I'm going to move my stuff into the little room and work there. That was an improvement. She no longer had to feel he was watching her all day. Soon after he started working in the little room, she went in there to clean up, while he was gone at school, and tried to shift the placement of a heavy cardboard box containing winter clothes. It tipped and came open, and she found a fifth of bourbon, half full, that had lain hidden in the folds of an overcoat. She considered taking it out and putting it among the official bottles in the kitchen cabinet, but in the end she laid it carefully back where it seemed to belong. She resurrected the manuscript of A New Yorker Discovers the Middle West and worked fairly steadily on it for some days. But she couldn't make it cohere. The trouble, she decided, was that the essential point of the article was a lie. She hadn't discovered the Middle West any more than she had discovered Europe. One Sunday morning, she sat in the rocking chair in a robe, with Cindy sprawled across her lap. She held her breakfast coffee mug in one hand, stroking Cindy's bristly fur with the other, and she sang a childhood song in a small voice, scarcely aware of singing at all. "How do you do, my Cindy? How do you do today? Won't you be my partner? I will show you the way." "Know what?" Jack said, smiling at her from the breakfast table. "The way you carry on with that dog, anybody'd say you want a baby." She was startled. "A baby?" "Sure." He got up and came to stand beside her, and his fingers began to play with a lock of her hair. "Doesn't every woman want a baby sometime?" The advantage of being seated while he stood over her was that she didn't have to meet his eyes. "Oh, I don't know," she said. "Sure, I guess so. Sometime." "It might be pointed out," he said, "that you're not getting any younger." "What's all this about, Jack?" "Let Cindy get down, stand up, and come and give me a hug, then I'll tell you." He wrapped her close in his arms, and she put her head against his chest so that it still was not required to look at his eyes. "Listen," he said. "When I got married, I didn't know what I was doing. Did it for all the wrong reasons. And for years now, ever since the divorce, I've been saying I'd never do it again. But the point is, you've changed all that, Emily. Listen. Not now, not now, baby, but soon. As soon as the damn book's done. Do you think you might consider marrying me?" He took both her hands and held her at arm's length. His eyes were shining and his mouth was curling into a shape of shyness and pride like that of a boy who's just stolen his first kiss. There was a tiny trickle of egg yolk on his chin. "Well, I don't know, Jack," she said. "It's a thing I'd have to think about, I guess." "Okay." He looked hurt. "Okay, I know I'm no prize package. It isn't you. It's me. I just don't know if I'm ready for—" "Okay," I said. And after a while he went into the little room and shut the door. They still took walks nearly every afternoon. The country was rich with autumn foliage, but now it was Emily who tended to walk with her head down, keeping her own counsel, looking at her shoes. Without saying anything about it, they avoided the route that led past the solitary oak tree. In November, she made up her mind to leave him. She would go back to New York, but not to Food Field Observer. She would find a better job, and a better apartment, too. She would embark on a new and better life, and she would be free. All that remained was breaking the news. She formed the opening phrases in her mind and rehearsed them several times. "Things aren't right, Jack. I think we both know that. I've decided the best thing to do for both of us is to—" And she sat waiting for him outside the closed door of the little room. When he came out, he moved as if he'd been shot in the back. He sank into the sofa across from her, and she looked at him closely for signs that he might have been nipping from the secret bottle, but he was sober. His eyes were as round as an actor in the final moments of a tragedy. "I can't," he announced, barely above a whisper, and she was reminded of the way Andrew Crawford had said, "I can't," in bed years ago. Can't what? Can't write. She had comforted him so often at times like this that now she was empty of all consolation and reassurance. She could only tell him what was true. "I wish you wouldn't say that," she said. "You do? Well, so do I. I wish a lot of things." It was clear that she couldn't tell him now. She waited 2 or 3 days until she was damned if she'd wait any longer, and then she said it. "Things aren't right. I think we both know that. I've decided the best thing to do." She could never afterwards remember how she finished that sentence, or what reply he made to it, or what she said next. She remembered only his brief show of raffish indifference and then his rage, when he shouted and threw a whiskey glass against the wall. He seemed to feel he might get her to stay if only they had a loud enough quarrel. And then his collapse into pleading. "Oh, baby, don't do this, please. Don't do this to me." It was 2 in the morning before she could make a bed for herself on the sofa. With the fall chilling rapidly into winter, she went back to New York alone. She knew she was awake because she could see morning light in the pale floating shape of a closed Venetian blind far away. It wasn't a dream. She was lying naked in a bed with a strange man in a strange place with no memory of the night before. The man, whoever he was, had a heavy arm and leg flung around her, clamping her down, and in her struggle to free herself, she knocked over a bedside table that fell with a crash of broken glass. It didn't wake him, but he groaned and turned away from her. That made it easy to crawl down to the foot of the bed and get out, avoiding the glass, and feel her way along the wall for a light switch. She didn't panic. Nothing like this had ever happened to her before, but that didn't mean it would ever happen again. If she could find her clothes and get out of here and get a cab and go home, it might still be possible to put the world in order. When she found the switch, the apartment sprang into existence around her, but she didn't recognize it. She still didn't recognize the man either. He was facing away from her, but she could see his profile. She studied it as carefully as if she were making a drawing from life, but it meant nothing. The only familiar thing in the room were her clothes, draped over the back of a corduroy armchair not far from where the man's shoes and pants and shirt and underwear lay strewn on the floor. The word sordid came into her mind. This was sordid. She got dressed quickly and found the bathroom, and while combing her hair at the mirror, she realized that getting out of here wasn't absolutely essential. There was another alternative. She could take a hot shower and go to the kitchen and make coffee and wait for him to wake up. She could greet him with a pleasant morning smile, a slightly reserved, sophisticated smile, and as they talked, she'd be sure to remember everything she had to know: who he was, how they'd met, where she'd been last night. It would all come back, and she might easily decide she liked him. He might make Bloody Marys to ease their hangovers and take her out for breakfast, and it might turn out to be. But this was the counsel of irresponsibility, of promiscuity, of sordidness, and she quickly decided against it. Back in the room where he slept, she righted the spindly table that had fallen with its load of bottles and glasses. She found a sheet of paper and wrote a note for him, which she propped on the table. "Be careful. Broken glass on the floor. E." Then she let herself out of the apartment and was free. It wasn't until she was on the street, it turned out to be Morton Street near 7th Avenue, that she felt the weight of all the unaccustomed drinking she must have done last night. The sun assaulted her, sending yellow streaks of pain deep into her skull. She could barely see, and her hand shook badly in trying to open the door of a taxicab. But riding home, inhaling the hot wind that came in through the cab window, she began to feel better. It was Saturday. How could she be so sure it was Saturday when she'd forgotten everything else? And that gave her 2 full days of recuperation before she had to go back to work. It was the summer of 1961, and she was 36. Soon after coming back from Iowa, she'd been hired as a copywriter for a small advertising agency, and she became something of a protege to the woman who ran it. It was a good job, though she would rather have been in journalism, and the best part of it was that she would live in a high, spacious apartment near Gramercy Park. "Morning, Miss Grimes," said Frank at the desk. There was nothing in his face to suggest that he might have guessed how she'd spent the night, but she couldn't be sure. She walked through the lobby with a bearing of unusual severity, in case he was following her with his eyes. The wallpaper of the hallway was patterned in a yellow-on-gray design of rearing horses. She had passed it hundreds of times without a glance. But now the first thing she saw on getting off the elevator was that someone had penciled a long, thick penis jutting out from between one of the horse's hind legs, with big testicles slung beneath it. Her first impulse was to find a pencil eraser and rub it out, but she knew that wouldn't work. It would have to be obliterated with new paper. Alone and safe behind her own locked door, she took pleasure in finding everything in her home was clean. She spent half an hour soaping and scrubbing herself in the shower, and while there she began to remember the events of the night. She had gone to the apartment of a married couple she scarcely knew in the East 60s, and it had turned out to be a bigger, noisier party than she'd expected. That accounted for the nervousness she had made her drink too fast. She closed her eyes under the pelting of hot water and recalled a sea of talking, laughing people out of which several strangers' faces came up close. A jolly bald man who said the whole preposterous idea of Kennedy for president had been a triumph of money and public relations. A thin, dapper fellow in an expensive suit who said, "I understand you're in the ad game, too." And the man who was probably the one she'd slept with, whose earnest voice had talked to her for what seemed like hours, and whose plain, heavy-browed face was very likely the face she had studied this morning. But she couldn't remember his name. Ned? Ted? It was something like that. She would put on clean, comfortable clothes and drink coffee. She would have loved a beer but was afraid to open one, and was just beginning to enjoy a sense of her life's coming back to solidity when the telephone rang. He had struggled awake. He had groaned through his own morning ablutions and guzzled a beer. He had found the number she'd probably given him and prepared a courtly little greeting for her, a mixture of apology and reawakened desire. Now he would ask her out for breakfast or lunch, and she would have to decide what to say. She bit her lip and let the phone ring 4 times before she picked it up. "Emmy?" It was her sister Sarah's voice, and it sounded like that of a shy, serious child. "Look, it's about Pookie, and I'm afraid it's bad news." "Is she dead?" "No, but she's very... Let me start at the beginning, okay? I hadn't seen her for 4 or 5 days, which was sort of strange because she's usually, over here quite a lot. So this morning I sent Eric over to the garage apartment to sort of check on her. and he came running back and said, "Mom, you better get over there." She was lying on the living room floor without any clothes on, and at first I thought she was dead. I couldn't even tell if she was breathing, but I was pretty sure I could feel a very faint pulse. Another thing, she'd gone to the. Can I be basic? You mean she'd emptied her bowels? That's right. Well, Sarah, people do that when they're. I know, but there was a pulse. Anyway, as luck would have it, our own doctor is on vacation, and the man filling in for him is the kind of rude young guy I'd never seen before. He examined her and said she was alive but in a coma. And he asked me how old she was, and I couldn't tell him. You know how Pookie's always been about her age. And he looked around and saw all these empty whiskey bottles, and he said, "Well, Mrs. Wilson, nobody lives forever." Is she in the hospital now? Not yet, he said. He'd make arrangements, but it might take time. He said we could expect the ambulance sometime this afternoon. It still hadn't come by the time Emily eased herself off the sweltering train at St. Charles, where Sarah met her in the old Plymouth she shared with her sons. "Oh, I'm so glad you're here, Emmy," she said. "I feel better about everything already." And driving very slowly, puzzling over the gear shift and the floor pedals as if she'd never quite mastered the knack of them, she began to take her sister home. "It's funny," Emily said as they passed a giant pink and white shopping center. "When I first came out here, this was all open country." "Things change, dear," Sarah said. But nothing was changed about the old Wilson place, except that tall weeds had long eclipsed the little Great Hedges sign. Tony's maroon Thunderbird stood glistening in the driveway. He bought himself a new one every other year, and nobody else was allowed to drive it. Sarah had explained once that this was his sole extravagance. "Is Tony home?" Emily asked. "No. He went off fishing for the day with some of the guys from Magnum. He doesn't even know about any of this yet." Then after she'd parked at a respectable distance from the Thunderbird and gotten out to stand frowning over the car keys in her hand, she said, "Look, Emmy, I know you must be starving, but I think we ought to look in on Pookie first. I mean, I don't want to have her just lying there, okay?" "Sure," Emily said. "Sure, of course." And they walked on crunching gravel to the sun-baked box of the garage, whose garage space was too narrow for modern automobiles. Emily had visited her mother in the upstairs apartment several times, listening to her talk for hours under the close beaver-board ceiling, staring at photographs of herself and Sarah as children on the smudged beaver-board walls, waiting for the first possible chance of escape. But nothing prepared her for what she found now at the top of the creaking stairs. The naked old woman lay face down as if she'd tripped on the rug and fallen forward. The heat of the place was all but unbearable. She might easily have collapsed from the heat alone. And it was true about the whiskey bottles. There were 6 or 8 of them around the room, all Bellow's partner's choice and all empty. Had she been embarrassed to put so many bottles into the trash for one of the boys to remove? "Girls, I'm terribly sorry about all this," she seemed to be saying. "Isn't there something we can do?" "Do you think we could get her into bed?" Sarah said, for when the ambulance comes. "Right. Good idea." First they prepared the bedroom. The tangled sheets looked as if they hadn't been changed for many weeks, and Sarah couldn't find clean ones, but they did their best to make the bed presentable. Then they went back to get her. They were both sweating freely by this time and breathing hard. Crouching, they eased her over on her back. Emily took her under the armpits and Sarah under the knees, and they carried her. She was small but very heavy. "Careful of this door frame," Sarah said. "It's narrow." They sat her on the bed and held her upright while Sarah worked with a comb at her sparse hair. "Never mind that, dear," she seemed to say as her loose head wobbled under the comb. "I can do that later. Just cover me, cover me." "There," Sarah said. "That's a little better. Now if you can sort of turn her, I'll bring her feet up and we'll... That's it. Easy, easy. There." She was lying face up with her head on the pillow, and her daughter stood back from the ugly old body with a sense of relief and accomplishment. "You know something?" Sarah said brightly. "I'd give a lot to have that good a figure when I'm her age." Hmm. Does she have a nightgown or something? I don't know. Let's look. All they could find was a light summer robe that was almost clean. Stooping and jostling each other, they worked a sleeve of it up one soft arm and stuffed the flimsy cloth under her back to bring the other sleeve into place. When the robe was finally closed and fastened, their mother was dressed, and they drew the top sheet up to her chin. Well, I can tell you it hasn't been easy, Sarah said as they went back into the living room to gather up the whiskey bottles. It hasn't been easy having her here over the past, what's it been now? 4 years? I can imagine. I mean, look at this place. Holding 3 or 4 bottles in one arm, she used her free hand to gesture around the apartment. Every surface in sight was filmed with grime. The ashtrays were heaped to overflowing with very short cigarette butts. And come here, look at this. She led Emily into the bathroom and pointed down the toilet bowl, which was brown both above and below the waterline. Oh, if only she could have stayed in the city, Sarah said, with things to do and people to see. Because the thing is, there was never anything for her to do out here. She'd always be over at the house and she wouldn't watch television. She wouldn't let us watch television. She'd talk and talk and talk until Tony was nearly out of his mind. And she'd, I know, baby, Emily said. They went downstairs. The fresh air felt good, even in the heat, and carried their armloads of whiskey bottles to the kitchen door of the main house, where they pressed them deep into the garbage can that was crawling with flies. You know what I think? Sarah said as they sat exhausted at the kitchen table. I think we both deserve a drink. The ambulance arrived in the mid afternoon. 4 quick, vigorous young men in gleaming white who seemed to enjoy their work. They strapped the old woman into an aluminum stretcher, brought her downstairs with swift delicacy, shoved her inside their vehicle, and slammed its doors and were gone. That evening, Sarah drove Emily to the hospital, where a tired looking doctor explained the nature of a cerebral hemorrhage. Their mother might die in the next day or so, he said, and she might live for a good many years with severe brain damage. In the latter case, she would probably have to be institutionalized. And of course, institutions cost money, Sarah said as they rode slowly homeward through the clean new suburbs. And we haven't got any money. Eat, said a big electric sign just ahead. Beneath it, in small letters, was the word cocktails. And Sarah steered the old Plymouth into the parking lot. I didn't feel like going home just yet, anyway, she said. Did you? When they were settled in a slick booth inside, she said, I really wanted the air conditioning more than the drink. Doesn't it feel wonderful? Then she raised her glass for a toast, looking suddenly very young, and said, Here's to Pookie's making a full recovery. Well, Emily said, I don't think we'd better count on anything like that, Sarah. The doctor said, I know what he said, she insisted, but I know Pookie too. She's a remarkable woman. She's tough. I bet she bounces back from this. Just wait and see. There was no point in arguing. Emily agreed that they would wait and see. For a little while there was no talk at all, and Emily used the silence to dwell with bewilderment and chagrin on the way she had woken up this morning. Ned? Ted? Would she ever figure it out? Had she had what drunks call a blackout? When she came into focus on her sister's face again, it was bright with proud talk about Peter, who would be starting college in the fall, and who viewed college only as a necessary preparation for being accepted into General Theological Seminary. All these years, and his ambition hasn't wavered once. That's what he wants to do, and he's going to do it. He's a remarkable boy. And how about Tony Jr.? He must have finished high school last year. That's right, except the thing is he didn't graduate. Oh? You mean his grades weren't good enough? That's right. Oh, he could have graduated, but he spent practically the whole year running around with this. Haven't I told you about that? A girl, you mean? She's not a girl. That's the whole point. She's 35 years old. She's divorced and she's rich and she's ruining him. Ruining him. I can't even talk to him anymore, and neither can his father. Even Peter can't talk to him. Oh, well, Emily said a lot of boys go through things like that. I imagine he'll be all right. Probably be a good thing for him in the long run. That's what his father says. Sarah looked pensively into her glass. And Eric, well, Eric's sort of like Tony Jr. Sort of like his father, too, I suppose. Never been a student. All he cares about is cars. Are you getting any writing done, Sarah? Oh, not really. I've more or less given up on the humorous family life sketches. I did 4 of them, but Tony said they weren't funny. He said they were good, well written, good details, held your interest and all that, but he said they weren't funny. Maybe I was trying too hard. Could I read them sometime? Sure, if you want to. Only you probably won't think they're funny either. I don't know. Humor is a lot harder than, serious stuff. Harder for me, anyway. And Emily's mind went away again, thinking of her own troubles. She returned only when she realized that Sarah had brought the conversation around to money. And have you any idea what Tony's take home pay from Magnum is? She was saying. Wait, look. Here, I'll show you. She rummaged in her purse. Here's the stub from his last paycheck. Just look. Emily had expected it wouldn't be much, but even so, she was surprised. It was a little less than she earned at the advertising agency. And he's worked there 21 years, Sarah said. Can you imagine? It's that stupid old business of the college degree, you see. All the men his age with engineering degrees are in top management now. Of course, Tony has a supervisory position too, but it's much lower down in the organization. Our only other income is the rent from the cottage, and most of that goes into upkeep. And have you any idea of the taxes we pay? I guess I've always thought old Joffrey helped you out to some extent. Joffrey's poorer than we are, dear. That little import office barely pays the rent in the city, and Edna's been very sick. So there isn't any inheritance or anything. Inheritance? Oh no, there's never been anything like that. Well, Sarah, how do you manage? Oh, we do. Just barely, but we manage. On the first of every month, I sit down at the dining room table and I make the boys sit down with me too. At least I did when they were younger. It's been good for them to learn about handling money. And I divide everything into accounts. First and foremost is the GH account. That covers GH? Great Hedges, Sarah said. Why do you call the place that? What do you mean? It's always been called. Pookie gave it that name, baby. I was there when she thought it up. She did? And Sarah looked so stunned that Emily was sorry she'd said it. They both reached for their drinks. Look, Sarah, Emily began, it's probably none of my business, but why don't you and Tony sell that place? The houses wouldn't be worth anything, but think of the land. You've got 8 acres in one of the fastest growing parts of Long Island. You could probably get. Sarah was shaking her head. No, no, that's out of the question. We couldn't do that. It wouldn't be fair to the boys. They love the place, you see. It's their home. It's the only home they've ever known. Remember how awful it was when we were little, never having it? But the boys are grown, Emily said, and the alcohol was beginning to work in her. She spoke more sharply than she'd meant to. They'll all be leaving soon. Isn't it time you and Tony to think of yourselves? The point is, you could get a good, efficient modern house for half of what you're spending on. That's another thing, Sarah said. Even if it weren't for the boys, I can't quite picture Tony and me in some pedantic little. Pedantic? You know, some conventional little ranch house like all the others. That isn't what pedantic means. It isn't? I thought it meant conventional. Anyway, I don't see how we could ever do a thing like that. Why not? The argument went on for half an hour, going over and over the same ground until in the end, when they were getting up to go back to the car, Sarah suddenly gave in. Oh, you're right, Emmy, she said. It would be good for us to sell the place. Good for the boys, too. There's just one hitch. What's that? You'd never convince Tony. Back at the house, they walked through the garbage-smelling kitchen, through the dining room, across the musty, creaking living room. where Emily always expected to find old Edna curled up and smiling on the sofa, and into what Sarah called the den, where Tony and Peter were watching television. "Hi, Aunt Emmy," Peter said in a manly voice, getting to his feet. Tony rose slowly, as if reluctant to leave the screen, and came forward with a can of beer in his hand. He was still in his fishing clothes, speckled with bait stains, and his face was bright with sunburn. "I say," he said, "I'm very sorry about Pukey." Peter turned off the booming television, and Sarah gave them a full report on what the doctor had said, concluding with her own fact-defying prognosis. "I bet she bounces back." Tony said. For hours that night, long after Tony and Peter had gone to bed, long after Eric and even Tony Jr. had come slouching in with mumbled greetings for their aunt, and mumbled expressions of sorrow about their grandmother, the Grimes sisters stayed up to talk and drink. They started out in the den and later moved into the living room, which Sarah said was cooler. There Emily sat cross-legged on the floor for easy access to the liquor on the coffee table, and Sarah sank into the sofa. "And I'll never forget Tenafly," Sarah was saying. "Remember when we lived in Tenafly? In that sort of stucco house with the bathroom on the ground floor?" "Sure, I remember." "I was 9 then, and you must have been about 5. It was the first place we lived after the divorce. Anyway, Daddy came out to visit us there once, and after you were in bed, he took me out for a walk. We went to the drugstore and had black and white ice cream sodas. And on the way home, I can still remember that street, the way it curved around. On the way home, he said, 'Baby, can I ask you a question?' Then he said, 'Who do you love more, your mother or me?'" "My God, did he really say that? And what did you say?" "I told him," Sarah sniffled. "I told him I'd have to think it over." "Oh, I knew, of course." Her voice wavered out of control, but she recovered it. "I knew I loved him much, much more than Pookie, but it seemed terribly disloyal to Pookie to come right out and say it. So I said I'd have to think it over and tell him the next day. He said, 'You promise? If I call you on the telephone tomorrow, will you tell me then?' And I promised. I remember not being able to look Pookie in the face that night and not sleeping very well. But when he called up, I told him, I said, 'You, Daddy.' And I thought he was going to cry, right there on the phone. He used to cry a lot, you know." "He did? I never saw him cry." "Well, he did. He was a very emotional man. Anyway, he said, 'That's wonderful, sweetheart.' And I remember being relieved that he wasn't crying. Then he said, 'Listen, as soon as I can arrange a few things, I'm going to have you come and live with me. It might not be right away, but it'll be soon, and we'll be together always.'" "God," Emily said. And then, of course, he never did anything about it. "Oh, I stopped expecting it to happen after a while. I stopped thinking about it. And you had to go on living with Pookie and me." Emily fumbled for a cigarette. "I had no idea you went through anything like that." "Oh, don't misunderstand," Sarah said. "He loved you too. He always used to ask me about you, especially later, when you were growing up, what you were like, what you'd like for your birthday, you know. It's just that he never really got to know you very well." "I know." Emily took a drink, finding her keen sense of melancholy enhanced by the way the alcohol seemed to go straight from the roof of her mouth into her veins. She had a story of her own to tell now. It might not be as sad a story as Sarah's, but it would do. "Remember Larchmont?" she began. "Sure." "Well, when Daddy came out for Christmas that year," she told of how she'd lain awake to hear her parents talking and talking downstairs, and how she'd called out for her mother, who had come up smelling of gin, and said they were coming to a new understanding, and how all hope had been lost the next day. Sarah was nodding in corroboration. "I know," she said. "I remember that night. I was awake too. I heard you call out." "You did?" "And I heard Pookie come up. I was excited as you were. And then a little later, maybe a half an hour later, I got up and went downstairs." "You went downstairs?" "And there wasn't much light in the living room, but I could see them lying together on the sofa." Emily swallowed. "You mean they were getting laid?" Well, there wasn't much light, but he was on top, and it was a very passionate embrace. And Sarah brought her glass up quickly to hide her mouth. Oh, Emily said. I see. They were both silent for a while. Then Emily said, I wish you'd told me that a long time ago, Sarah. Or, no, come to think of it, I guess I'm glad you didn't. Tell me something else. Have you ever understood why they got divorced? Oh, I know her version. She felt stifled. She wanted freedom. She always used to compare herself with the woman in a doll's house. A doll's house, right. Well, it was partly that, but then a couple years later after the divorce, she decided she wanted to come back to him and he wouldn't have her. You sure? Positive. Why? Well, think about it, Emmy. If you were a man, would you have taken her back? Emily thought about it. No, but then why did he ever marry her in the first place? Oh, he loved her. Don't worry about that. He told me once she was the most fascinating woman he'd ever met. You're kidding. Well, maybe he didn't say fascinating, but he said she cast a spell. Emily studied the drink in her hand. When did you have all these talks with him anyway? Oh, mostly during the time I had braces. I didn't have to go into the city once a week, you see. The dentist only wanted to see me once a month. That once a week story was something Daddy and I made up so we'd have more time together. Pookie never did figure it out. Neither did I. And even now at 36, Emily was jealous. And who was Irene Hammond? She asked, the lady I met at Daddy's funeral. Oh, Irene Hammond was only around in the last few years, toward the end of his life. There were others. There were? Did you meet them? Some of them. 2 or 3 of them. Were they nice? One of them I didn't like at all. The others were all right. Why do you suppose he never married again? I don't know. He said once, this was when I was engaged to Donald Clellan, he said that a man ought to be happy in his work before he got married. And maybe it was partly that. He was never happy in his work, you see. I mean, he'd wanted to be a great reporter, somebody like Richard Harding Davis or Hayward Braun. I don't think he ever understood why he was only a copy desk man. And that did it. They had been holding back tears all evening, all night, but that phrase was too much. Sarah started crying first, and Emily got up from the floor to take her in her arms and comfort her, until it was clear that she couldn't comfort anyone because she was crying too. With their mother lying in a coma 20 miles away, they clung together drunkenly and wept for the loss of their father. Pookie didn't die the next day or the day after that. By the end of the 3rd day, it was assumed that her condition was stabilized, and Emily decided to go home. She wanted to be back in her air-conditioned apartment, where nothing smelled of mildew and everything was clean, and she wanted to get back to work. Pity we don't see more of you, Emmy, Tony said as he drove her swiftly to the station in his Thunderbird. When he parked near the platform to wait for the train, she realized she might never have a better chance than this for bringing up the question of selling the place. She tried to do it tactfully, making it clear that she knew it was none of her business, implying that it must surely be something he'd thought of before. Oh, God, yes, he said, as they heard the sound of the approaching train. I'd love to be rid of it all. Let them take a bulldozer and bury it. If it were up to me, You mean it isn't up to you? Oh, no, pet. It's Sarah, you see. She'd never hear of it. But Sarah says she wants to do it. She told me you were the one who didn't. Oh, he said, looking bemused. That's so. The train was on them with an overwhelming noise. There was nothing for Emily to do but say goodbye. When she got off the elevator at her floor, the great cock and balls still protruded from the wallpaper horse. She was almost too tired to stand. The apartment was as cool and welcoming as she'd known it would be, and she sank into a deep chair with her heels sliding straight out on the floor. This was fatigue. Tomorrow she would ride up to Baldwin Advertising. She would do her job with all the intelligence and efficiency they had come to expect of her, and she would drink nothing for a week except a beer or a glass of wine after each workday. after work each day. In no time at all, she would be herself again. But meanwhile, it was only 8 o'clock in the evening. There was nothing in place she wanted to read, nothing to watch on television, nothing to do but sit here and go over and over the time in St. Charles in her mind. After a while, she was up and pacing the floor with her fist in her mouth. Then her telephone rang. "Emily," said a man's voice. "Oh, wow. Are you really there? I've been calling you and calling you." "Who's this?" "It's Ted. Ted Banks. Friday night, remember? I've been calling you since Saturday morning. 3, 4 times a day and you were never home. Are you okay?" Hearing his voice and his last name brought it all back. She could see his plain, heavy-browed face now and remember the shape and the weight and the feel of him. She could remember everything. "I was out of town for a few days," she said. "My mother was very ill." "Oh, how is she now?" "She's better." "Good. Look, Emily, first of all, I want to apologize. I haven't had that much to drink in years and years. I'm not used to it. I'm not either. So if I made a total fool of myself, I'm terribly. That's okay. We were both pretty foolish." She wasn't tired anymore, except in a pleasant, well-earned way. She felt good. "Well, listen, do you think I could see you again?" "Sure, Ted." "Oh, great, that's great. Because I really... When? How soon?" She looked with pleasure around her apartment. Everything was clean. Everything was ready. "Well," she said, "almost any time, Ted. Why not tonight? Give me half an hour to wash up and change, and then, come on over." The nursing home, a modest Episcopalian retreat at which the Grimes sisters shared the cost of their mother's care, lay roughly halfway between the city and St. Charles. At first, Emily went out there once a month. Later, she cut it down to 3 or 4 times a year. Her first visit in the autumn after Pookie's collapse was the most memorable. "Emmy," the old woman cried, lying half-raised in her hospital bed, "I knew you'd come today." At first glance, she looked startlingly well. Her eyes gleamed and her false teeth were bared in a triumphant smile. But then she began to talk. Her wet mouth labored, slurring syllables in a slow parody of the way she'd talked all her life. "And isn't it wonderful how everything's worked out so well for us? Just imagine. Sarah's a real princess. She looked... And look at you. I always knew there was something special about our family." Emily said. "Well, you're looking fine. How do you feel?" "Well, I'm a little tired, but I'm just so happy and so proud of you both. Especially you, Emmy. Lots of girls marry into European royalty. Only you know something funny? I still haven't learned to pronounce his last name. But how many ever get to be First Lady? Are you comfortable here?" "Oh, it's nice enough, of course. I knew it would be nice. Built right into the White House. But I'll tell you something, dear." She lowered her voice to an urgent stage whisper. "Some of these nurses don't know how to behave when they're dealing with the president's mother-in-law. Anyway." She settled back on her pillow. "Anyway, I know you must be terribly busy. I won't keep you. He stopped by to see me the other day." "He did?" "Oh, just for a few minutes. After his press conference, and he called me Pookie and gave me a little kiss. Such a handsome figure of a man, with that beautiful smile. He has such flair. Just imagine, the youngest man ever elected president in American history." Emily planned her next sentence carefully. "Pookie," she said, "have you been having a lot of dreams?" The old woman blinked several times. "Dreams? Oh, yes. Sometimes." She looked suddenly frightened. "Sometimes I have bad dreams, terrible dreams about all kinds of terrible things. But I always wake up." Her face relaxed, and when I wake up, everything's wonderful again. On her way out of the place, passing the open doors of many murmurous rooms filled with beds and wheelchairs, occasionally glimpsing an ancient person's head, she found a nurse's station where two thick-legged young women in white were drinking coffee and reading magazines. "Excuse me, I'm Mrs. Grimes' daughter, Mrs. Grimes in 2F." One of the nurses said, "Oh, you must be Mrs. Kennedy." The other, with a tired little smile to show she was only kidding. "Can I have your autograph?" "That's what I wanted to ask about. Is she always this way?" "Sometimes, not always." "Does her doctor know about it?" "Well, you'd have to ask him. Doctor's only here Tuesday and Friday mornings." "I see," Emily said. "Well, look, is it better to sort of play along with her in something like this, or to try and... Doesn't make much difference one way or the other," the nurse said. "I wouldn't worry about it, Mrs. Grimes. I'm not married." The delusion didn't last long. Throughout the winter, Pookie seemed to know who she was most of the time, but her talk was much less coherent. She was able to sit in her chair and even to walk around, though once she splattered the floor with urine. By spring, she had turned morose and silent, speaking only to complain of her failing eyesight and the nurse's neglect and the shortage of cigarettes. Once, having demanded that a nurse bring her lipstick and a mirror, she studied her frowning reflection and daubed a full crimson mouth on the surface of the mirror. During that year, Emily was promoted to copy supervisor of Baldwin Advertising. Hannah Baldwin, a trim and vigorous gal in her 50s who liked to have it known that hers was one of the only 3 agencies in New York run by a woman, told her she had a real future in the business. "We love you, Emily," she said more than once, and Emily had to admit it was reciprocated. Well, not love exactly, surely not love on either side, more of a mutual respect and satisfaction. She enjoyed her work, but she enjoyed her leisure a great deal more. Ted Banks lasted only a few months. The trouble was mainly that they both felt an irresistible urge to drink too much when they were together, as if they didn't want to touch each other sober. Things were on a much more intelligent footing with Michael Hogan. He was a rugged, energetic, surprisingly gentle man. He ran a small public relations firm, but talked so little about his work that she sometimes forgot what he did for a living. And the best thing about him was that he made almost no emotional demands on her. It couldn't even be said that they were close friends. Whole weeks might pass without her hearing from him, or even caring. And when he did call, "Emily, feel like having dinner?" It was as if they'd never been apart. They both liked it that way. "You know something?" she told him once. "There aren't very many people you can enjoy spending Sunday with." He said. He was shaving, standing just inside the open door of his bathroom. She lay propped on pillows in his big double bed, leafing through his copy of the New York Times book review. She turned a page, and a photograph of Jack Flanders jumped out at her, looking much older and even sadder than when she'd seen him last. There were pictures of 3 other men in the same full-page review, which ran under the heading, "A Spring Poetry Roundup." She skimmed the columns quickly and found the part about Jack. In middle age, the once volatile John Flanders had settled into an amiable acceptance of things as they are, pierced time and again by a sharp regret for things lost. Days and Nights, his 4th book, displays the careful craftsmanship we have come to expect of him, but too frequently there is too little else to admire. Are acceptance and regret enough? For daily living, perhaps, not one suspects for the higher demands of art. This reader misses the old Flanders fire. Some of the love poems are affecting, particularly Iowa Oak Tree, with its strong erotic final stanza and proposal of marriage, with its curious opening lines, "I watch you fooling with a dog and wonder, what does this girl want from me?" Elsewhere, however, one is tempted to dismiss poem after poem as commonplace or sentimental. The long final poem should probably have been cut from the manuscript before it went to the printer. Even its title is awkward, "Remembering London Revisited," and the work itself performs a bewildering exercise in double flashback. The poet regrets a time when he stood at a London doorway regretting still another earlier time. How much chagrin can a single poem bear without becoming ludicrous? One closes this slim volume with something of the poet's own regret within regret malaise, and with all too little of his hope. Turning to the brilliant, audacious work new Turning to the brilliant, audacious new work of William Kruger, we find what can only be called an embarrassment of poetic riches. The buzz of Michael Hogan's electric razor had stopped some time ago. She looked up and found him peering over her shoulder. "What's the deal?" he asked her. "Nothing, just something here about a man I used to know." "Yeah, which one?" There were 4 photographs on the page. She could have easily pointed to one of the others, even Kruger, and Michael Hogan would never know or care, but she felt a stirring of old loyalty. "Him," she said, touching her forefinger to Jack's face. "Looks like he just lost his last friend," Michael Hogan said. One Friday morning, Sarah called Emily at the office to inquire happily if she was free for lunch. "You mean you're in town?" "That's right." "Fine," Emily said. "What's the occasion?" "Well, Tony had to come in for a business meeting today. That's part of it. But the main thing is we've got tickets to see Roderick Hamilton in Come Home, Stranger tonight. And afterwards we're going backstage to meet him." Roderick Hamilton was a famous English actor whose new play had recently opened in New York. "That's wonderful," Emily said. "He and Tony went to school together in England, you see. Have I ever told you that?" "Yes, I believe you have." "And at first Tony was too shy to write to him, but I made him do it. And we got back to this really nice, really charming letter saying of course he remembered Tony and wanted to see him again and wanted to meet me. Isn't that exciting?" "It certainly is. So look, we're staying at the Roosevelt and Tony will be gone all day. Why don't you come up here for lunch? They have this really nice place called the Rough Rider Room." "Well," Emily said, "that sounds appropriate for a couple of old Rough Riders like you and me." "What, dear?" "Never mind. Would 1 o'clock suit you?" When she first walked into the restaurant, she thought Sarah hadn't arrived yet. All the tables were filled with strangers. But then she saw that a plump, little overdressed matron sitting alone was smiling at her. "Come sit down, dear," Sarah said. "You look wonderful." "So do you," Emily said, but it wasn't true. In St. Charles, wearing country clothes, Sarah still might look her age, which Emily quickly calculated was 41. But here she looked much older. She looked older. Her eyes were lined and shadowed, and she had a double chin. She was slump-shouldered. She had evidently been undecided about which of the several pieces of bright costume jewelry to wear with her cheap beige suit, and had solved the problem by wearing them all. In the past year, her teeth had developed heavy brown stains. "Something from the bar, ladies?" the waiter inquired. "Oh, yes," Sarah said. "I'd like an extra dry martini, straight up, with a lemon twist." Emily ordered a glass of white wine. "I have to work this afternoon." And they both tried to relax. "Do you know," Sarah said, "I was just thinking. This is the first time I've been to New York in 9 years. It's funny how everything's changed." "You ought to get in more often." "I know. I'd love to. It's just that Tony hates it so. He hates the traffic, and he says everything's too expensive." "Oh," Sarah said, brightening again, "did I tell you we heard from Tony Jr.? Some months ago, having concluded his affair with a divorcee, she had found an older man. Tony Jr. had gone off to enlist in the Marine Corps. He's at Camp Pendleton's, California, and he sent us a nice long letter," Sarah said. "Of course, Tony's still furious with him. He's even threatened to disinherit him." "Disinherit him from what?" "Well, disown him. But I think experience will do him a world of good." "And how are the other boys?" "Oh, Peter's busy at college on the dean's list every semester, and Eric, well, it's hard to tell with Eric. He's still mad about cars." Then the talk turned to their mother, whom Emily hadn't visited for some time. The social worker at the nursing home, Sarah said, had called her to report that Pookie was becoming a discipline problem. "How do you mean a discipline problem?" "Well," he said, "she does things that upset the other patients. One night, about 4 a.m, she went into some old man's room and said, 'Why aren't you ready? Have you forgotten this is our wedding day?' And apparently she went on and on like that until the old man had to call the nurses to come and take her back." "Oh my God." No, but he was very nice about it, the social worker, I mean. He just said that if that kind of behavior continues, we'll have to take her out of there. Well, but where would we put her? Sarah was lighting a cigarette. Central Islip, I guess, she said, exhaling smoke. What's that? The state hospital. It's free. Oh, but I understand it's very nice. I see, Emily said. Over her second martini, Sarah made a shy announcement. I suppose I really shouldn't have this, she said. My doctor told me I drink too much. He did? Oh, it wasn't a grim warning or anything. He just told me to cut down. He said my liver's enlarged. I don't know. Let's not talk about sad things anymore. I hardly ever get to see you, Emmy, and I want to hear all about your job and your love life and everything. Besides, I'm going to meet Roderick Hamilton tonight, and I want to be in a good mood. Let's enjoy ourselves. But a few minutes later, she was gazing wistfully around the room. It's nice here, isn't it? She said. This is one of the places Daddy used to take me to just before he'd put me on the train. Sometimes we'd go to the Biltmore, too, or the Commodore, but this is the place I remember best. The waiters knew him here, and they knew me, too. They'd always bring me a double scoop of ice cream while Daddy had his double scotch, and we'd talk and talk. Afterwards, Emily couldn't remember whether Sarah drank 3 martinis or 4 at that lunch in the Rough Rider room. She remembered only that she herself was fuddled with wine by the time their chicken a la king arrived, and that Sarah ate very little of her portion. She didn't drink her coffee either. Oh dear Emmy, she said, I guess I'm a little drunk. Isn't that ridiculous? I don't know why Oh, but it's okay. I can have a little nap downstairs, and I'll have plenty of time before Tony gets back. Then we'll have dinner and go to the theater, and I'll be fine. She needed help in getting out of her chair. She needed help in walking across the floor, too. Emily had held her high and firmly under one soft arm, and in walking down the corridor to the elevators. It's okay, Emmy, she kept saying. It's okay, I can manage. But Emily didn't let go until they were up in the room, where Sarah tottered a few steps forward and collapsed on the double bed. I'm fine, she said. I'll just get a little sleep now and I'll be fine. Don't you want to take your clothes off? That's okay, don't worry about me, I'll be fine. And Emily went back to the office for a distracted afternoon's work. It wasn't until nearly 5 o'clock that she began to feel guilty pleasure. Now that she had seen her sister, it might be many months, maybe years before she would have to see her again. This would be an evening alone, and sometimes when she planned things right, she found she didn't mind being alone at all. First, she changed into comfortable clothes and got the materials for her light supper started in the kitchenette. Then she fixed herself a drink, never more than 2, and watched the CBS Evening News. Later, after she'd eaten and washed the dishes, she would sit in her deep chair or lie on her sofa with a book, reading, and the hours would pass uncounted until it was time to go to bed. When the telephone rang at 9 o'clock, it startled her, and the weak, plaintive sound of Sarah's voice, Emmy, brought her quickly to her feet. Look, Sarah said, I hate to ask you this, but do you think you could come up here to the hotel? What's the matter? Why aren't you at the theater? I didn't go. I'll explain it when I see you, okay? All the way uptown in a cab that kept getting caught in traffic jams, Emily tried to keep her mind empty. She was still trying to keep her mind empty when she walked down the long carpeted corridor to Sarah's door, which was an inch or 2 ajar. She thought of pushing it open but knocked instead. Anthony? Sarah called in a shy, hopeful voice. No, baby, it's me. Oh, come on in, Emmy. Emily went inside the dark room and let the door click shut behind her. Are you all right? She said. Where's the light? Don't turn it on yet. Let's talk a minute first, okay? In the dim blue light of the window, Emily could see that Sarah was lying on the bed, the way she'd left her this afternoon, except that now the bed was unmade and she appeared to be wearing only her slip. I'm awfully sorry about this, Emmy. I probably shouldn't have called you, but the thing is, well, I'll start at the beginning, okay? When Tony got back here, I was still drunk, I guess, and we had a terrible fight about it. And he said he wasn't going to take me to the play, anyway, he went to the play alone. He went to the play alone? That's right. Oh, you can't blame him. I wasn't in any condition to meet Roderick Hamilton. That part of it's all my fault. But the point is, you and I had such a good talks last summer, and I just called you up because I sort of need someone to talk to. I see. Well, I'm glad you did call. Can I turn the lights on now? I guess you might as well. Emily felt along the wall for the light switch, and when she found it, the room exploded into clarity. There was blood on the tangled sheets and on the pillow. There was blood down the front of Sarah's slip and all over her swollen, wincing face and in her hair. Emily sat down in a chair and shaded her eyes with one hand. I don't believe this, she said. I don't believe this for a minute. You mean he beat you? That's right. Could I have a cigarette, dear? Well, but Sarah, are you badly hurt? Let me look at you. No, don't. Don't come any closer, okay? I'll be all right. If I can just get up and wash my face, I should have done this before you came. She struggled to her feet and went unsteadily into the bathroom, from which came the sound of water running in the sink. God, she called back. Can you imagine this face being introduced to Roderick Hamilton backstage? Sarah, look, Emily said when they were together in the bedroom again. You're going to have to tell me a few things. Has this happened before? Sarah had managed to get her face almost clean. She was wearing a robe and smoking a cigarette. Oh, sure, she said. Happens all the time. I guess it's been happening once or twice a month for about, 20 years. It's not usually as bad as this. And you've never told anyone? I almost told Joffrey once, years ago. He saw a bruise on my face and asked me about it, and I almost told him. But I thought, no, that would only make more trouble. I don't know. I guess I probably would have told Daddy about it if he'd lived. The boys have seen it happen a few times. Tony Jr. told him once if he ever saw him do it again, he'd kill him. He said that to his own father. There were liquor bottles and an ice bucket on a low cabinet against the wall, and Emily looked at them with longing. All she had to do was make herself a drink, and she wanted a strong one. But she willed herself to stay in her chair, still shading her eyes with her hand, as if unable to look her sister full in the face. Oh, Sarah, she said. Oh, Sarah, why do you put up with it? It's a marriage, Sarah said. If you want to stay married, you learn to put up with things. Besides, I love the guy. What do you mean I love the guy? That sounds like a line out of some corny... How can you love someone who treats you like... A key scraped and turned in the lock, and Emily stood up to face him. She had her opening words prepared and ready. He came in blinking in surprise at seeing her. His expressionless face looked a little drunk, and he was dressed for the evening in a dark summer suit that Sarah had probably picked out in some cheap suburban department store. How was the play, you son of a bitch? Emily asked him. Don't, Emmy, Sarah said. Don't what? Isn't it about time somebody talked straight around here? How was Roderick Hamilton, you bullying, wife-beating bastard? Tony ignored her, moving past her with the look of a despised little boy ignoring his tormentors. But the room was so small that he had to brush against her on his way to the liquor cabinet. He set out 3 generous hotel room water tumblers and began pouring whiskey. His silence didn't faze her, and she decided that if he handed her a drink, she would throw it in his face. But she had a few more things to say. You're a Neanderthal, she told him, remembering what Andrew Crawford had called him long ago. You're a pig. And I swear, are you listening to me? I swear to God, if you ever touch my sister again, I'll... There was no way to finish that sentence except to repeat Tony Jr.'s threat. And she repeated it. I'll kill you. She drank. Apparently he had handed her a drink, and apparently she'd accepted it without thinking. and only now, with the alcohol spreading warm through her chest and down her arms, did she begin to realize how much she was enjoying herself. It was fine to be passionately in on in the right. It was fine to be passionately in the right on so clear an issue. The scrappy kid sister as avenging angel. She wanted this exhilaration to go on and on. Glancing over at Sarah, though, she wished Sarah hadn't washed her face and covered her slip and straightened up the bedclothes to hide the bloodstains. It would have made a more dramatic picture the other way. "It's okay, Emmy," Sarah said in the same calming, understanding way she had always said it in the childhood when Emily was out of control. Sarah had a drink in her hand now, too. For a moment, Emily was afraid she might have to stand here and watch while Tony sat down on the bed beside his wife and they performed the old smiling arm intertwining ritual from Anatole's. But that didn't happen. Tony seemed to draw composure from Sarah's. "It's okay, Emmy." He looked into Emily's eyes for the first time with an infuriating suggestion of a smile and said, "Not really very much anyone, not really very much one can say, is there? Won't you sit down?" "I will not sit down," she answered, and immediately spoiled the effect of that line by taking another long drink from her glass. The high pleasure of the confrontation was gone. She felt like a strident intruder in something that was none of her business. She managed to get off a few more plangent statements before leaving. Things she couldn't remember afterwards, probably repeating her own and Tony Jr.'s hollow threat of murder. And she asked Sarah several times, with what sounded like fake solicitude, if she was sure she'd be all right. Then she was out in the elevator, and then she was home, feeling like a fool. It took a great effort of will to keep from calling Michael Hogan. "It's just that I feel I can't be alone tonight," she would have said. "And there's a whole weekend to get through." Instead, she had a few more drinks by herself and went to bed. The phone rang late the next morning, and she was almost sure it would be Michael Hogan. "Feel like having dinner?" But it wasn't. "Emmy? Sarah, are you all right? Where are you?" "Downtown. I'm in a phone booth. Tony drove on back, but I told him I wanted to stay in the city. I wanted to sort of think things over. I've been sitting in the park and..." "Sitting in the park?" "Washington Square. It's funny how everything's changed. I didn't know our old house was gone. That whole block was torn down years ago," Emily said, "when they built the student center." "Oh, well, I didn't know that. Anyway, if you don't have any special plans, I thought maybe you might come down and meet me here. We could have breakfast or brunch or something." "Well," Emily said, "sure, where will I find you?" "I'll be in the park, okay? On one of the benches right near where the old house used to be. You don't have to hurry. Take your time." On the way downtown, Emily weighed the possibilities. If Sarah had left her husband, she might want to stay with her sister for a while, maybe a long while, which would inconvenience Michael Hogan. Still, Michael did have an apartment of his own. They could work something out. On the other hand, maybe she was only thinking things over. Maybe she would go back to St. Charles tonight. The park was filled with baby carriages and with laughing, athletic young men throwing frisbees. Its whole design had changed. The paths ran in different directions now, but Emily had no trouble remembering in passing the approximate place where Warren Maddox had picked her up. Sarah looked as pathetic on her bench as Emily had expected, small and dowdy in her wrinkled beige, lifting her soft, bruised face to the sun and almost visibly savoring visions of another time. Emily took her to a cool, decent coffee shop. She knew that if they went to a real restaurant, there would be irresistible Bloody Marys or beers. And for an hour or two, they talked in circles. "We're not getting anywhere, Sarah," she said at last. "You say you know you ought to leave him. You even say you want to leave him. Then when we start going into the practical aspects of that, you come back to this business of I love the guy. We're talking in circles." Sarah looked down at the congealed remains of an egg and sausage on her plate. "I know," she said. I always talked in circles, and you always talked in a straight line. I wish I had your mind. It isn't a question of mind, Sarah. It's just, yes, it is. We're a lot different, you and me. I'm not saying one way of looking at things is better than the other. It's just that I've always thought of marriage as being, well, sacred. I don't expect other people to feel that way, but it's the way I am. I was a virgin when I got married, and I've been a virgin ever since. I mean, she added quickly, I've never played around or anything. With the words played around or anything, she brought her cigarette quickly to her lips and squinted over it, either to hide embarrassment or to suggest a veiled sophistication. Well, fine, Emily said, but even if marriage is sacred, doesn't that imply that both parties ought to agree on it? What's sacred about the way Tony treats you? He does the best he can, Emmy. I know that may sound funny, but it's true. Emily exhaled a great cloud of smoke and sat back to look around the coffee shop. In a booth across the aisle, a couple of young lovers were murmuring side by side, the girl's fingers tracing little elliptical patterns on the inner thigh of the boy's tight, well-fitted blue jeans. Listen, Sarah, she said, let's take this whole discussion back to where we were a few minutes ago. You can stay at my place as long as you like. We can work together at finding you a place of your own and a job. And you don't have to think of it as a permanent separation. Think of it as, I know, dear, and it's very sweet of you, but there are so many complications. For one thing, what could I possibly do? There's any number of things you could do, Emily said, though the only thing she could picture was Sarah working as a receptionist in some doctor's or dentist's office. Where did all those pleasant, inefficient, middle-aged ladies come from, and how had they gotten their jobs? That's not important, she hurried on. The only important thing now is to make up your mind. Either go back to St. Charles or start a new life for yourself here. Sarah was silent, as if pretending to think it over for the sake of appearances. Then she said, I'd better go back, as Emily had known she would. I'll take the train back this afternoon. Why? Emily said. Because he needs you? We need each other. So it was settled. Sarah would go back. All of Emily's days and nights would be free for Michael Hogan and for whatever man might follow him in the long succession. She had to admit she was relieved, but it was a relief that couldn't be shown. And what you're really afraid of, she said, and intending it as a kind of taunt, what you're really afraid is that Tony might leave you. Sarah lowered her eyes, displaying the fine little blue-white scar. That's right, she said.